Hey y'all, let's talk about Sleepy Hollow. Okay, so if you compared this to the movie with Johnny Depp that Tim Burton directed, actually it was late 90s, so you may have never seen it. Anyway, if you compared it to that movie, you may say to yourself, wow, this story's kind of boring. And I think you might be right. I read the story and I was like, wow, this is absolutely boring. But then I started to do research on it and I started to really look into it and read into it. And I really now think it's more interesting than that Johnny Depp movie could ever be. It has such subtle nuances that are just amazing. So let's go on and talk about a few things. One of the first things I want to talk about is how it's Gothic. Okay, so I gave you an assignment where you need to find a piece of art or a book or a story or a movie, anything really, and tell me why it's Gothic. So I want to kind of work with you on this to see if we can see how this story is pretty Gothic. So the first thing I want to talk about with that is the setting. The setting of this piece is super Gothic. We have this town in upstate New York, totally isolated. It's almost completely Dutch. And it's away from the city, and we really do see the isolation in this piece, that Ichabod Crane is kind of an invader in this place. He doesn't belong there. So we have that, and I want to show you how our narrator describes it, because it's really, really interesting. Okay, so on page 42, he says that a person can go into Sleepy Hollow completely awake, but when he enters the town, and I'm going to quote here, he says, "The people are sure in little time to imbibe the witching influence of the air, to begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions." So, that's interesting. Okay, so number one, the place has a witching influence, almost like it puts you in sort of a trance. You're a different person when you're there. And then it also says that a person will dream dreams and see apparitions. If you know anything about what an apparition is, it's a ghost. So we already have this kind of setting for this dark place. And probably Tim Burton's, the best thing he did in that movie was that he had a really great setting that I really think followed the story. These people were just kind of isolated, almost asleep. There was already this sense that there were ghosts all around, so it's great. So there's that. Okay, so it sets it up nicely, and I do think there are a few other things. Number one, Ichabod Crane and his need for ghost stories. He loves a ghost story. And actually, we know that he really, when he left, he had nothing in his possession, except for like a book by Cotton Mather. Interesting, yeah, we know, because Cotton Mather was the guy who documented the witch trials, and he also documented some demon possessions as well. So we see, now we're set up with this guy who really is into the ghost stories. He likes being scared, and he loves to kind of see the non-scientific aspects of it. So even though he's a teacher, he really is into the kind of supernatural. So there's that. Then we have the Headless Horseman situation in and of itself. We have Ichabod who's riding his horse home. He's already a little scared because they've been talking about ghost stories, right? Sets it up perfectly. So then he's sitting on his horse riding home. He hears a little something. Oh, it's nothing. He starts singing his hymns to himself. And so it's really, really interesting what happens here. Yes, there is kind of a headless horseman creature, but I think probably what's more interesting is what he does to himself. And we've all been there. I know I used to, especially when I lived alone. I would lay in bed and I would be like, oh, there's a noise. What is that? Just nothing. And then I would hear it again, and then because you've heard this noise, everything else is amplified, and it's completely terrifying, and you go into a frenzy. Hopefully you've experienced that, and I don't seem like a crazy person. But he did that as well. You know, he worked himself up, and then, well, there was the horseman there as well, and that aspect is pretty goth as well. There was a headless horseman that was probably Brom, but anyway, it still was kind of dark. And then lastly, the ending is fantastic. The ending, we don't know what happens to him. I feel like not knowing is much more interesting than knowing, right? Yeah, I think it is, because now we have that kind of spooky, figure it out for yourself idea. Okay, so those are kind of some gothic aspects. If I were working just to tell you about gothic stuff, I would tell you more, so keep that in mind when you're doing your paper or presentation. Okay, so now that we've looked at some of the darker aspects of this piece, I want to talk about some other themes that I saw going on here. Number one, brain versus brawn. And we have to think, okay, what does that mean? We have Ichabod, who is the brains of the operation, versus Brom Bones, who is kind of the muscle, the brawn. And I wonder if his name has anything to do with that. Anyway, so we have this idea, and then we have Ichabod, who's relatively smart. He actually, punishes, let me say punishes, the stronger kids a lot more severely than he does the weaker children. So he already has some little issues with bullies himself. And then we have Brom, who is a total bully. Okay, so now in the bigger picture, we say Brain versus Brom. We look at who won. At worst, Ichabod was killed. At best, he was vanquished. He ran away. So either way, Bron won. Either way, Bron won. So that's kind of an interesting situation there. Now, I do want to talk about a few other things that I like in this. Besides Brain versus Brawn, which I think is a little bit more superficial, I think we have to look at this kind of city versus country dichotomy as well, where because Ichabod really is more of an outsider, he represents this kind of city, and then Brom and actually the rest of the people in Sleepy Hollow represent the country. Okay? Yeah, so there's that. And again, we have to think who won. The country beat out the city in this situation. But there's some interesting stuff here too. So we have Baltus von Tassel. He's Katrina's dad. He has acres and acres of farmland. It says he's not proud, he's not braggy, so he seems like a cool guy. But he has a lot of farmland. And if you look, there's some great stuff in here. We start to see that I don't even think that Ichabod is that into Katrina. I mean, I think he likes her. I think he thinks she's cute, right? But I think he wants her land and her money. And actually, on the top of page 48, it says pretty much that. It says he would have kids with her, but he saw himself on the land. Okay, so there's that. So we kind of see that maybe whatever. He's not really all that into it. But he is into the land. And then we have this one thing that I think is great, and it's such a great added bonus. It is his appetite. He has a ferocious appetite, right? Okay, so in this, we have this great scene on page 47. Okay, so on page 47, we have the land, Baltus von Tassel's land, spread out in front of us, right? Okay, so then the next paragraph down, still on page 47, we see how Ichabod pictures it in his mind. So he turns this sprawling land into a dish, a plate full of food, right? He says, okay, I can see the pigs roasting, I can see the quails, all on the plate. Everything is on the plate. So basically, he took this land and pictured it in a way that he could eat. Now you're like, what, Hunter, you're going crazy. But I think there's some really interesting things here. That basically, he wants to come in, consume, interesting word, consume the land. He wants to take over the land. And so now if you go back to that idea of city versus country, we have this idea that city kind of wants to come into the country and take over. Now, I think that's fun. I really think it's a great idea. I think it's fascinating. I think you could do a fabulous socioeconomic portrait of this. Now, I will say that I think, probably, at least on this level, it is kind of a reach. I think you could find a whole lot more to prove that point, but again, this is the highlights, so I think that's really cool. He wants to eat the land and eat the people. Again, the country won, so he didn't get to, but the idea is there. Okay, so that's kind of a fun idea. And then I want to talk about one more thing that I think is great in this story, and it's the art of storytelling. So this is such a funny thing. We have our narrator, and actually, our narrator is Diedrich Knickerbocker, right? Okay, but Diedrich Knickerbocker is not Washington Irving. So we have this story kind of given to us, almost removed from any origin. So our narrator gives us the story, and I think he does such a fun job, and I want you to go back and look at some of this stuff because it's really funny. At some points, we can see inside his head, like on page 47, we can see inside Ichabod's head. So then, we also see what happened whenever the Headless Horseman was chasing him, up to a point. Okay, so it's really interesting how some things are included and some things aren't included. So, number one thing that's not included, after the party, Katrina and Ichabod have this conversation. Now, we have ideas, and even our narrator gives us some ideas, but we know whatever it was, Ichabod was downtrodden after it was over. So what we can assume is that Katrina broke it off with Ichabod. But I think if at some points we can see inside of his head, why couldn't we understand or know what went on in that conversation? One example. Another example is what happened to Ichabod. Again, if we can see inside his head, why can't we know what happened to him in the end? The art of storytelling. And if you think about the way you tell a story, it's kind of fabulous. You tell a story in a way that you highlight the parts that you see as important. Maybe you leave out unimportant details. And so our narrator said, maybe what went on between them is not important. And the important part is that Ichabod freaked himself out. The important part is not that he disappeared. It's about the fear that kind of inspired him not being there anymore. So it's this great storytelling example. So you should go back and pay attention to it, and pay attention to the way you tell a story next time you do it. So it's just this, I love this story. It's so great. I feel like I could go on for days and days talking about Sleepy Hollow. Quick thing. You probably saw this, but I'll make sure you know that probably Katrina Von Tassel never really had a thing for Ichabod at all. Probably she was trying to make Brom Bones jealous, but poor little Ichabod, he didn't know it. So that's just one thing that popped into my head. So anyway, y'all have a good week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.